Our guest today, Anthony Rapp. Hi, Anthony.
Hello.
I'd like to just quickly run through a few of your credits. You have just recently returned to Rent, the musical in which you starred back, I guess 13 years ago when it first started in Workshop.
Yes.
And now back once again as Mark Cohen in Rent. In between, shows like You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, the revival in 1999, 6 Degrees of Separation, Precious Sons, a show that never officially opened on Broadway. We'll talk about that, The Little Prince and the Aviator. You've done a number of films, A Beautiful Mind, Dazed and Confused. Of course, in 1987, the film that many people remember to this day, Adventures in Babysitting, playing Darryl Coopersmith. You have your own book out, a memoir, so to speak, at a young age to have a memoir, called Without You, a memoir of love, loss, and the musical Rent. Let's start with Rent. You're back in Rent now. You had been in the original production, the Workshop, then the off-Broadway version, then Broadway, Chicago, London, the film version, and now here you are back in Rent. Why?
In the spring, I was working on a really exciting new musical that hopefully will see the light of day in a full production at some point. Believe me, there are plenty of those around. It just takes a long time for them to come to light. And I got an email from the producer of Rent, Jeffrey Seller, who said, what would you think about going back on the show for a few weeks with Adam Pascal, who was the original Roger? And I was like, really? And it had never really occurred to me that would come up. And the first thing I did was call Adam. I was like, is this true? Because I didn't know if they were just like a little ploy or, using us to help each other, convince each other or what. But he was certainly interested. He was coming to New York anyway to work on a record, and he was looking to do something while he was here. He's been eager to get back on stage in New York, as I have been. And it just was a perfect window of time. I was about to go to South Africa, where I just returned from where I directed the South African premiere of Rent. So I knew that was happening in my immediate future. And in the fall, I tend to go to a lot of, I get invited to go to a lot of colleges and do speaking about Rent and about my book. And so there was some of that lined up in the fall. But in the meantime, August is sort of a great month in terms of a window. And it just worked out perfectly. And it was just an exciting opportunity. I mean, I knew from having done the film, which was many years after having done the show, that the material still was incredibly fulfilling to perform. And then we did a 10th anniversary concert in 2006 at the Nederlander, and being back on stage after having done the film was even more exciting. So I didn't have any doubt of whether or not it would be fulfilling or exciting or fun or important to me as an artist. I was a little concerned about my body because I'm a little older and there's a lot of jumping and running around and all that stuff, and I felt a couple little aches and pains, but I've been holding up pretty well.
Well, here you are. It is a decade later, and you're back on stage in the same role. How does it feel then to be back in the same dressing room, the same theater, the same role, the same stage?
All that feels like home, and the audiences have been unbelievably welcoming. I mean, I don't know if other actors have talked to you about this notion, but when you walk out on stage, you're either walking into a room that's, maybe a little hostile sometimes, or skeptical, or warm and open. There's a variety of what you're walking into. And sometimes you can win an audience over if they're hostile or skeptical, and sometimes, but when they're already there for you, then it's literally you can do no wrong, and that gives that much more energy back and freedom to just fly with it. And from the first performance on July 30th, we walked out on stage. First, Adam walks out alone to like huge deafening screams. Then I walked out with the rest of the cast, and we got a standing ovation for like 2 minutes solid. And I start the show by saying we begin on Christmas Eve, and I had to literally just stand there and wait. I mean, I'm not going to try to quiet them down because they weren't about to quiet down, and that's not really the style of the show anyway. But it was amazing, and then it was just like that was sort of the way it's been for the last 2 weeks since we've been back on stage. It's just we don't always get a standing ovation, but the response and the sort of love and support coming back at us is really amazing. And I think that's been great for the rest of the cast to feel too, because we got something like that back in 1996, 97 on a regular basis, but I think the cast that's been in the show, some of them have been there for a while, but I don't think they've ever experienced anything quite like that with the show, and it's a nice gift for them as well, I think.
I imagine you have a lot of Rent groupies who return to see the show.
I think we have some people that have returned, and some of them have managed to say hello afterwards, although the outside the theater stage door scene is so much more frenzied and intense than it ever was even back then. And back then we always had people waiting for us after the show, and we would sign autographs and take pictures and stuff. But now it's just exponential, and it's not just exponential in number; it's also in the kind of intensity of their energy. And it's a little bit like, I mean, it almost is like a cliche, but people have been saying this who've witnessed it. My friends who've been by the theater after the show, they've been like, it's like the Beatles. It's that kind. I mean, there's not as many people, but it's like the footage you see of them when they landed in whatever, I don't know if it was LaGuardia or Kennedy, and they got off that plane and there was that crowd of people there clamoring for them. I mean, it's like that, which is kind of amazing. It's also a little crazy. It's a little strange. I mean, I grew up in Joliet, Illinois, this small town, and I was sort of a dork growing up, and I didn't really imagine that I'd be kind of clamored at by teenage girls, you know. But but it's also incredibly flattering, and I'm certainly grateful for it.
Well, Rent the musical has become iconic, so to speak. It's been running for more than 11 years, which is an extremely long run by anybody's standards on Broadway. And the show, in large measure due to the message that it has become one of those iconic or classic shows on Broadway now. Even though the music may not be classic in the Rodgers and Hammerstein sense, the storyline certainly is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's... And I think the music, it is rock and roll and pop influence, certainly, but what it shares with Rodgers and Hammerstein or Jules Stein or Irving Berlin or any of the classic Cole Porter, any of them, is melody. This notion of a hook, of a catchy melody that can really stick in your brain and is the window into which people walk through the story. And I think that's something that Jonathan understood, that it can't simply be in your face rock and roll. It's also got to have something accessible to it. And when we're on stage singing about some of the things we're singing about, but it's with this really fun, catchy melody that lets the message go even deeper in some ways than it ordinarily would.
But Rodgers and Hammerstein, especially Hammerstein who wrote the lyrics, were optimists. And the music that Hammerstein wrote, the words he wrote were optimistic words. Like take South Pacific at the end of World War II. That was very optimistic in its outlook. Here you have Jonathan Larson writing Rent. It's a totally different story. It's about AIDS and people with other problems. But there's an optimism about that as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I guess to me, it's always been a clear-eyed optimism. And it's not like a pie-in-the-sky optimism. It's taking a hard look at the difficulties that people face in this day and age and saying, in the face of those, it's still possible to live fully. This phrase, living with, not dying from disease. That's at the time the show was written in 1996, that was still kind of a revolutionary notion. It's much more commonly thought now. If you're living with cancer, you're living with AIDS, you're living with MS. But back then, even, it wasn't that long ago that it was still sort of, you're dying from it. And that alone is part of that. But so it's the key word there is with. It's including the reality of the situation, and it's saying living with that. And part of the thing too of Rent is it's in the finale. There's the two phrases that coexist. I die without you, which is, you could say, a negative thought or a sad thought, and no day but today. That these two things, again, they coexist. That they don't cancel each other out. They're part. It's all part of life.
And again, it's that optimism, not dying of, but living with disease, whatever disease it is.
Right.
That becoming the mindset.
Yes.
And of course, the story of Jonathan Larson creating the show and then literally dying himself, not of a disease, but of an aneurysm, a heart aneurysm, on the eve of the first public performance off Broadway. That in itself sounds like something out of Hollywood, out of a movie, but I think that has given the show a certain aura that it probably would have had, but not to the same extent.
Yeah, it's always been a question, not a question that we've asked, but sometimes some critics over the years have sort of contemplated what might have happened to the show had Jonathan not died. I mean, one thing I know is that the show would have been even better because Jonathan was still working on the text, and the last song he wrote for the show was "Take Me or Leave Me," which to me is one of the best songs in the show, and so he was at the peak of his powers. And he was eager for the preview process to begin and for him to continue tinkering with it. I know that. I mean, there might be 2 or 3 new songs in the show. Who knows? So that's one thing I know. The other thing is I know that we as a cast were already very connected to one another and to the material, but then when he died, it just made it that much more important to all of us to do right by it and to make it live. And so I think that it just deepened our commitment to one another and to the piece. So that helped its impact, I think.